So what are some of the persistent and perennial ethical problems that every humanitarian agency and every humanitarian emergency tends to face? I'm going to think generally about 5 categories and try and illustrate each one. The first one is the constant risk of actual harmfulness in humanitarian program, what ethicists call problems of potential maleficence. In other words, bringing about bad things rather than bringing about good things, negative consequences, unintended negative consequences. The genuine problem that you can introduce aid into a situation and potentially, against all your intentions, make that situation worse. So this problem of making the situation worse, the problem of potential harmfulness, maleficence. And if I give you an example, for example, from somewhere like Liberia in the 90s, we might think of many thousands of displaced people, terribly destitute and displaced all around the country, suffering from the ruthlessness of roaming bands of armed men who have made them flee their villages and their homes. And aid agencies trying desperately to reach those communities, to get access to them and to bring food to them. And they succeed, and they bring food distributions into various areas in Liberia. And then, to their horror, the next day after distribution, they learn that on the way home from the distribution, many of these people were stopped at impromptu checkpoints by armed guards and armed men, and had their aid robbed. Some of them were beaten up, some of the women were raped, and in fact their situation was rendered even worse for many individuals. So that's an example, and agencies have to think consciously and deliberately and know as much as they possibly can to mitigate those kinds of risks of maleficence in humanitarian work. The second major ethical risk that humanitarian agencies often face is around their political principles of neutrality and independence, because in a situation like a war or disaster, aid agencies inevitably have to deal with everybody that is necessary to get access to affected communities. This means dealing with all parties to a conflict or all political groupings in a disaster. And this often raises serious moral risks of association, whereby humanitarian agencies find themselves having to deal with armed forces, police, certain kinds of politicians, certain community leaders who may be powerful but not popular, and also people who are known to have carried out human rights abuses and violations. These problems of association run 2 risks for humanitarian agencies. First of all, they, as agencies, can be captured by the vested interests of particular parties to a conflict and therefore lose their independence and neutrality in effect. But secondly, they can also be sort of polluted and felt to be friendly with a group or a leader or a faction who the affected community find absolutely intolerable and find to be a profound enemy. Therefore, an agency can find it has a risk of pollution. Even if it's not losing its independence, it can be perceived as on the other side somehow, and therefore hated and at risk even of attack, but certainly at risk of a major loss of credibility. Moving on from this, the third classic ethical risk that humanitarian agencies face is the risk of complicity. That in fact, by bringing their aid, their international legitimacy into a situation, they may in some form, in some way, become complicit in the human rights abuses of warring parties. Complicity is probably the greatest moral anxiety of humanitarian agencies, because they would regret nothing more than aid they bring in a spirit of compassion and kindness, and the effort to support people's human rights is actually twisted and manipulated into resourcing a system or an armed force or a structure that is violating people's human rights. The classic case of this is from Goma refugee camps in 1994 and 5 after the Rwandan genocide. These camps were inside what is now the Democratic Republic of Congo. And those camps were soon heavily dominated by former génocidaires, armed groups, who began to control the camps and control the aid and tax it and steal it to begin to resource a new militia formation which sought to reinvade Rwanda. So this Goma case is the classic case of the potential of complicity between humanitarian agencies and rights-violating factions and groups. So inevitably in humanitarian action, humanitarian organisations become complicit to some degree by being involved with and contributing resources into a situation which can be leveraged for other inhumane purposes. But again, the moral responsibility on humanitarian agencies is to monitor these kind of contributions very carefully and to gauge whether their association, their contribution is acceptable because it is frankly bringing more good than harm to a situation, or whether it has become so detrimental that they are now resourcing a structure that is oppressing people even more than they were oppressed before. The fourth classic area of humanitarian ethical problem is around staff security. Wars are often very dangerous, and how much is a humanitarian agency prepared to risk the lives and health of its own staff in order to bring life-saving and health-making resources to a civilian population? And here, humanitarian agencies have to make very real judgments about levels of risk to their staff. Are they prepared to risk their lives for the lives of others? Are there special situations where sometimes it is wiser to deploy national staff only instead of international staff, because international staff might be at greater risk of targeting? Or vice versa, is it sometimes better to play international staff into a situation to protect national staff? And the key issues here really are sound risk management judgment, but they're also about gathering the consent of your own staff. How ready are people to risk their lives for the lives of others? And these are hard moral questions that have to be answered in each emergency and often on a daily basis in very extreme conflicts. Finally, the last classic risk, moral risk in humanitarian ethics, is the risk of humanitarian agencies' own power. And many scholars have noticed, and many field workers have noticed, that actually humanitarian agencies can become so powerful in a given situation. They have all the resources, they are organising IDP camps, they are really the source of a lot of people's livelihoods and health and education and food, that they become almost all-powerful in certain contexts. And how does one manage that power responsibly? When does humanitarian power actually become oppressive and unkind? When do humanitarian agencies become so powerful they think they can just expect people to wait in the scorching sun for food distribution for the whole day and treat them badly and give them each a card and push them into various corners until the distribution is ready? When does humanitarian kindness actually shift into humanitarian cruelty? This is a very important area where agencies have to be very conscious of the level of their power, the way their power is perceived by the affected population, and how they can be responsible in working with that population to ensure that the processes with which they distribute aid and try and secure people's safety are themselves compassionate rather than cruel. I hope these brief videos have helped to serve as an introduction to humanitarian values, humanitarian principles, and the challenges of bringing those principles to reality on the ground in very difficult and challenging field operations. And if you're interested to read more, my book, which is called Humanitarian Ethics, A Guide to the Morality of Aid in War and Disaster, is available from Hurst in the United Kingdom and from Oxford University Press in the rest of the world. Thank you.